So welcome. This is our first philosophy talk of the semester. We have 3 more coming up. The next one is the week after next. And if you heard about this one, you'll hear about that one as well. The next one is Think Like a Feminist. Carol Hay is the lecturer. I think this is October. I don't remember off the top of my head, but you'll find out if you found out about this one. Anyway, it's a new format for us, this Zoom lecture, but one of the great things about it is that it is financially feasible for us to bring in some distinguished guests who are really quite far away. And today is no exception. So today we get to bring in Professor Robert Garcia of Baylor, which if you didn't know, that's in Texas, a bit of a flight from here. He's even on Central Time, so it's a little earlier for him. Anyway, we're excited about his talk, Midas Touch Metaphysics. The way it's going to work is he is going to speak for about half an hour or so, depending. I will keep track of what's going on in the chat, and then when he is done, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Garcia.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here virtually and meet some of you for the first time and so on. I'm going to share a screen here. You should be able to see my opening slide. I just want to make sure. And okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Just going to make sure I can see faces here. 1 second. Okay. There we go. All right, things look good on my end. Okay, so I've picked the title for this talk, Midas Touch Metaphysics, because I want to use the story of Midas to kind of provoke you into asking certain questions, the kinds of questions that bother me. And so in a moment or two, I'll come back to that story. So my goal for this talk is to kind of puzzle you, give you a puzzle, and tell you how I try and solve the puzzle, and see what you think of the puzzle and my solution. So to get there, I'm going to do some stage setting that involves introducing what has been called the problem of universals. I'll mention a few of the solutions that have been offered to that problem. And then as a kind of interlude, we'll talk about briefly the myth about Midas and the golden touch. Then that'll help me introduce the puzzle that I've been working on, which is a dilemma for a certain solution to the problem of universals, a dilemma for a view called Trope Theory. And then probably we'll be out of time at that point, but if not, I'll tell you something about my preferred solution, where I introduce the idea that tropes might be identical with divine actions. And then we'll close with some questions. So, some stage setting. What's the problem of universals? Well, it's really a poorly named problem, first of all. As many people have pointed out, it's a cluster of problems. And even to say it's a problem for universals is to kind of misconstrue the issue. Universals are a very specific kind of entity that metaphysicians have invented to solve the problem of universals. But we can think about what this problem is by stepping away from philosophy for a while and just asking what sorts of things exist. And we can point to lots of things like apples and billiard balls, yourself, gold, cups, and so on. All these things are what we could just call objects. But what we want to ask as well is whether, in addition to objects, their properties exist. So apples, if you have a red apple, in a normal way of speaking, it has the property of being red or redness. If you're a human being, which I hope you are, you have the property of humanness or being human, and so on. So gold has the property of goldenness. A billiard ball has the property of sphericity, and so on. So we have objects on one hand. They're the things that are somewhat familiar to us, and then there are their properties, which we often refer to. to explain the world and make sense of it. I think my wife has the property of being beautiful, and that matters to me. So properties are an important part of our world. But do we want to think that properties exist in addition to the objects, right? So this becomes a question about ontology, or what exists. So in addition to the objects, do we want to believe that properties exist as well? So if we made an inventory of what there is, a big long bullet point list, would we list alongside of these objects their properties as well? So why I think that properties exist is a central question in metaphysics. One way to approach existence questions is to think about whether we need to posit a certain kind of entity, in this case, a property, in order to make sense of the world, right? And a useful way of thinking about this is to think about roles that need to be played. And one way to think about these roles is to think of them as explanatory roles, right? So do we need properties to explain something about the world? Many people think the answer is yes, that there are so-called property roles, and those roles need to be played. And that's just a way of saying we need to believe that there are properties because there are certain jobs that only properties can do. So there are many different property roles that have been identified. One has to do with semantics. So some people think that properties can provide meaning for terms, for example. So what is it that I'm referring to when I say redness is a color? It looks like I'm referring to concepts or meanings and so on. I'm not just referring to red things. If you follow that line of thought and you find it persuasive, then you might think that we need properties to play a semantic role, that we need to believe there are properties to make sense of the fact that we say meaningful things and refer meaningfully to things like redness itself. I'm not going to be talking about the semantic role for properties. I'm going to be talking about what I call the character grounding role. And this is a more traditional approach to arguing for the existence of properties. So Plato is famous for talking about carving nature at the joints. And here the idea is, if you look out your window or you just pay attention to the world, it looks like the things that you see fall into natural classes, like they fall into groups that are naturally classified. So all the apples form a natural class and so on. All the protons form a natural class and so on. So that's carving nature at the joints. Nature seems to have joints along these lines of character. And one way to think about what properties are for is their way of explaining how there are these joints and where they fall. So I'm going to identify or point to two kinds of joints, if I could put it this way, and I call both of these together character phenomena. So these are phenomena concerning the character of objects. The first is what's called the 1 over many, or and this is what I call inter-object joints. So these are joints between objects, if I could put it that way. So I have O1, O2, and O3. These are just ways of talking about, in the abstract, I guess, 3 different objects. And O1 is hard, white, and spherical. O2 is pliable, white, and spherical. O3 is pliable, brown, and spherical. So the 1 over many has to do with the fact that all 3 objects have a property in common. There's one being spherical over the many, O1, O2, and O3. So there's a property that they have in common. That's one of the character phenomena. It's the fact that if you look at objects in the world, it's easy to find objects which together display the same property, as we would say. The other character phenomena is the many over 1, and this has to do with the fact that if you look at just a single object, that single object will display multiple characteristics. So O1 isn't just charactered in one way, it's charactered in many ways. It's hard, white, and spherical. So this is the many characteristics over one object. So the many over one and the one over many are different aspects to nature's joints, if you will. So character grounding has to do with accounting for the character phenomena, and there's lots of debate about whether we just need to account for one of these or both of these, or whether one reduces to the other, and so on. But setting aside those details, the question is whether we need there to be properties to account for the character phenomena. If there are properties, then the idea is that they ground character in virtue of sort of explaining how it is that multiple objects can have the same property, or one object can have multiple properties. So for example, if you have a billiard ball, for example, that is spherical, the property of sphericity would ground the fact that the ball has the shape that it does. So we would say that the ball is spherical in virtue of having this property of sphericity. Or if you look at all the billiard balls and you say, hey, look, they're all spherical. In virtue of what, do they all have the same property? Well, you would say, well, there is sphericity and they all have it, right? That's one way of approaching the explanation of character. So O1, for example, is thickly charactered in that it's hard, white, and spherical. And it is so, if you believe in properties, in virtue of having three different properties: hardness, whiteness, and sphericity. Okay, so that's the problem of universals, and it has to do with going in for a certain view of properties to account for the character phenomenon. Of course, there are lots of different ways you can sort of understand character grounders, and in fact, you can, if you want, try and argue that there are no character grounders. So there are different views about character grounding, and I'm going to sort of show you a little flow chart, if you will, to drill down to the view that I have in mind that I want to talk about. So, are there character grounders, right? You can say yes or no, and if you say no, you're what's called an austere nominalist. You think there are no characteristics, right, per se. There are charactered objects, but no characteristics, right? So if you're an austere nominalist and you're asked to make an inventory of what there is, you list objects. So there are balls, people, apples, and so on, but there are no characteristics per se. There is no humanness that falls on the list. There are human beings, but there's no humanness per se. That's austere nominalism. That's an unpopular view, at least among my friends. If you think there are character grounders, you have many questions to ask now. And the first one is, well, are they fundamental? That is, are they basic, or do you construct character grounders out of other things? So if you think that they're not fundamental, then character grounders are built up out of more basic things. So a good example of this is what's called class nominalism. So if you're a class nominalist, you think that properties are classes, and classes are built up out of their members. So the class of all red objects would be the property of redness, right? So properties are classes. Classes aren't basic. They're built up out of more fundamental things. If you don't go that route and you think that properties are fundamental, then you're not constructing all the properties out of more basic things. Properties are found at the basic level, at least some of them. So if you think that there are, among the fundamental entities, properties, you have to answer the question, well, are properties shareable or not? And this is a way of talking about whether properties are universals or tropes. And these are terms of art for two different ways of thinking about properties. So if you think that there is such a thing as sphericity, and it's basic, and there's one of them, and it characterizes all the spheres at the same time, right? So all the billiard balls that exist in the world and all their various locations and times, if you think there's just one property, sphericity, that grounds the character of all those balls, then you think that sphericity is a universal. It's capable of characterizing multiple objects at the same time. If you think that that's crazy or have other reasons for rejecting it, but you still want to believe that there are properties that are fundamental, then you deny that they're shareable, and you're what's called a trope theorist. So the trope theorist believes that there are properties, but they can't characterize multiple objects at once. So there is a sphericity for all the billiard balls that there are. So if there's 5 billion billiard balls, there are 5 billion sphericity properties, each of them numerically distinct, but exactly similar. They're all sphericities. Okay, so now we arrive at a question that I like to run a poll for, although I won't, for the sake of time, I won't do this, but for all my metaphysician friends, I like to ask them, so sphericity, if there is such a property as sphericity, is the property itself spherical? And you'd be surprised there's no agreement on this. You know, I'll ask this at a party for metaphysicians and I'll start a fight because, you know, one person says, no, of course they're not. And the other person says, wait, no, they are. Of course they are. And it turns out there's this somewhat latent disagreement about whether or not properties are what we call self-exemplifying. So if you think that sphericity is itself real and is itself spherical, you're thinking of it as a spherical entity itself, then we say that you take that property to be self-exemplifying. Another way to talk about that view is you take properties to be paradigmatic. They're paradigms. So our tropes versus universals flowchart gets even more messy and complicated because you can think of tropes as either self-exemplifying or not, but you can also think of universals as either self-exemplifying or not. I've labeled the trope options module tropes and modifier tropes. So if you think that a trope is self-exemplifying, that is, for example, if you think that a sphericity trope is itself spherical, then it's a module trope. It's a little modular thing. If you think, no, it's not itself spherical, then it's what I call a modifier trope because it's going to have to modify something else. It's going to have to spherize something else. I'm largely going to set aside issues about universals for the rest of this talk, but almost everything I think that I'll say will apply equally well, I think, to universals, but I'm more familiar with tropes. So we're going to stick with talking about tropes. If I can advance. Here we go. So what I want to do now is get clear on the differences between these two different kinds of tropes. And that will help us see where the puzzle is that I want to puzzle you with. So let's think about module tropes, first of all. So these are the ones that I say are self-exemplifying. So what you want to remember, though, is a trope is supposed to be a sort of the place where the explanation stops, right? So if you were to ask, hey, this sphericity trope that is itself spherical, what makes it spherical, right? The answer is nothing. It's just primitively spherical, right? What you don't want to say, of course, as a trope theorist, is say, well, the spherical tropes are all spherical in virtue of instantiating some universal sphericity. No, because you're a trope theorist, you don't have anything like that. And on pain of regress, you don't want to sort of say, well, tropes are spherical in virtue of having sphericity tropes. No, the usual way to think about it is a trope is just a primitively spherical entity if it's a sphericity trope. So it's primitively naturally charactered. That is, if we assume that shape as a natural characteristic, to say that the trope self-exemplifies is just to say that it's primitively charactered in the way that it is. There's nothing outside of itself that explains why it's charactered as it is. The other thing to note about module tropes is, and this is more my sort of imposing a read on them that I think is required, because trope theorists are a little ambiguous about this. And it's the idea that a module trope should be thinly charactered, right? So a sphericity trope is not only itself spherical, it's not supposed to be charactered in any other way. So it's a primitively and merely spherical entity. Why do I put that on there? Well, if you allow that module tropes are multiply charactered, then they just turn into ordinary objects pretty quickly. And you don't get anywhere by way of explanation, because the thing you start with is this thickly charactered object like a billiard ball that's spherical, red, pliable, or whatever. So if your explanation stops with a trope that is itself spherical, hard, and pliable, or whatever, then you haven't explained anything. So thinness of character at the level of tropes is arguably required for them to do any kind of explanatory work. So in effect then, a module trope is a primitively singly propertied object. So a sphericity module trope then is spherical and not charactered in any other way. And of course, that's going to make you frown and puzzle, because how could that be? Obviously, you want to add some kind of size to it. You know, every sphere has a size. So there are worries here lurking about how something can, whether it's even possible for something to be merely singly charactered. But we need to set those worries aside. Okay, so much for module tropes. Modifier tropes are even more mysterious, because a modifier trope doesn't have any natural character itself. So a sphericity modifier trope is not itself spherical. It's supposed to make something else spherical. So it's a spherizer that is not itself spherical. So it accounts for the fact that something has natural character, but it doesn't account for something else having natural character by itself having that character. So if you know anything about truth makers, I like to compare this to truth makers, where a truth maker is not itself necessarily true, right? So a truth maker is something that makes a proposition true, but the truth maker may be a rock, right? And rocks aren't true. Okay, so those are the two different views about tropes, modifier tropes, and module tropes. And now we can take a break, and I thought we'd put Midas in here as a stimulus in a way, because I know that what we just covered was some pretty heady metaphysical stuff. So now we can just think about old Midas just for a moment. So the story of Midas, if you know, here's the brief, short version of it. Midas did a good deed. The gods saw him do this good deed. The god said to Midas, "What do you want? I'll grant you any wish." And Midas was this stingy guy, materialist. He said, "Here's what I want. I want everything I touch to turn to gold," right? And then at first he was happy about it. You know, he turned things into gold, and it was fun, and he felt like he was getting rich. But then of course he got thirsty and went to go drink something, and unfortunately his Starbucks turned into gold, and he couldn't actually drink it, right? Or his food turned to gold, and that turned out to be rather frustrating. And then one part of the myth says that his daughter came to him, and I don't know why he didn't think of this, but he gave his daughter a hug and turned her to gold too. All this was a tragedy. So that's what Midas was able to do. Touching things turns them into gold. The gods allowed him to sort of reverse the curse by doing something in a river, maybe bathing, I forget. And when he did this, we're told that gold flowed from him into the river. And so we had lots of sand in this river that was gold. Or better, they found lots of gold in the river. So that's the story. we're not supposed to ask how these things are supposed to work. You're supposed to tell, hey, it's a myth, don't ask these questions. How did Midas turn stuff to gold just by touching it? It just seems crazy, mysterious. Well, I like to ask these questions and come up with answers. So I have two answers. There may be other ones. One is to think of Midas as an alchemizer. So in other words, that he was practicing alchemy, this old medieval science that attempted, but let's just pretend that you could do it, to transform ordinary metals into gold, right? So you give me a chunk of lead and I alchemize it and I make it into gold. That's one way to think about what Midas was doing. He was changing things from what they are into gold by simply transforming the metals. The other way to think about it, sorry, that's Midas the alchemizer, and here's just a picture for you to look at. Trying to pull it off through alchemy. The other way to think about it is as a gold infuser. So if you think about making tea, you put a tea bag into some hot water, and what happens? Well, if you look at it, the particles from the tea infuse into the water, right? So, a fun question to ask is, this red stuff that you put into the water, does the water become red? In what sense? Or do you just have red stuff mixed in with the water? And so it looks red because you see the red stuff infused into it, right? Really, it's something like the latter. Water itself is just H2O, right? It doesn't include an extra little red molecule attached to it. So here the idea of Midas, the gold infuser, is that in some strange, mysterious way, he sort of pours gold into something, like he did in the river when he washed. And it sort of fills something up with gold. And in virtue of filling it with gold, it makes it gold. So I know that those are rough and ready, not fully cashed out ways of reading Midas, but I hope that'll do for our purposes. So I want to say that when you think about modifier tropes, they remind me of Midas the alchemizer. They somehow, so on this view, Midas the alchemizer, it's not the case that Midas is pouring gold from within himself into an object and making it gold. That's the infuser view. Instead, it just somehow, magically, it seems, makes something else golden. Whereas the gold infuser view says that that Midas somehow inserts gold into things, like the tea into the water, and thereby makes it gold. And module tropes seem to be infusers in this kind of way, whereas modifier tropes seem to be something like alchemizers. So with that in view, hopefully that doesn't make it less clear. It might, but it'll just be fun to talk about. We can use Midas to introduce this puzzle that I have for you. Going the wrong way. So two different views about tropes, modifier tropes and module tropes. And if we think about each one, we can discover some problems for each one. So first, let's look at the module trope view. And unfortunately, there are two versions of this view, at least. It has to do with how is it that this module trope grounds the character of an object. So if it's a sphericity trope, how is it that this merely spherical object makes another thing spherical? How does that work? Well, there are two ways that I want to mention here. One is to think of tropes, module tropes, as proper parts of something else and nothing more. I call that Themotrope Theory. It may also be Themotrope Theory. I call it Themotrope. I don't know how to pronounce things. The other way to think of it is as module tropes as what I call character makers. So let's look at these each at a time. So module tropes if you think of them as mere proper parts of something. So on this view, to say that an object has a property is simply to say that it has a proper part, and that proper part is a trope, and it's a module trope, right? So it's a container approach to having a property. So on this view, to say that an object has sphericity really just means to say that the object is a collection or a container even, and one of the things inside of it is a merely spherical thing. So the problem with this view, or maybe it's not a problem because I say it just wears this on the, it advertises this as just here's what the view says. This view denies that there really is thick character. So on this view, there really isn't anything that's multiply charactered. Instead, there are just collections of thinly charactered things, all tightly like squashed together in space, but there's nothing as a result that is thickly charactered. And one reason to think that is, here's this cat here that I have for you. And you put a cat into a container, it doesn't make the container into a cat, right? So you could say the cat isn't a hat, but it doesn't follow that the hat is thereby a cat, right? The hat is not feline in any strict sense, right? You might say, well, that's a very feline hat you have there, but that's only a matter of speaking. That's an equivocation on the word feline, right? You'd say there's a feline creature in the hat, but if you go on to say the hat is feline, you've equivocated, right? You used it in the strict sense to talk about the animal, but in a very loose sense to talk about the hat. The hat is not a cat, even though it has a cat as a proper part. Okay. I felt very Dr. Seuss there for a moment, but okay. So the reason I call this Themotrope Theory is because it says that thick character is just an illusion, right? And the example I have for you, why I call it Themotrope Theory, is because a Themotrope is this toy where you have, like pictured here, you have a disc, for example, and on one side there's a bird, on the other side there's a cage, and if you twist it, the string, then it looks like there's a bird in a cage, right? It's like this bottom picture here, where it looks like there's a bird in the cage. There really is not a bird in a cage. There just looks like there is. And so on this theory, it denies that there is thick character, but allows that there's an illusion of thick character because these thinly charactered things are so tightly, intimately bound up together. Okay. Okay, so pros and cons to this view. The upside is that there's nothing mysterious about how character rounding works. It's just as boring as part-whole relationships, right? It's just containers, things having things as proper parts. That's all having a property amounts to. And so the advantage is there's nothing mysterious or even strange or even novel about this approach to having a property. The downside is that there's no thick character. And so it doesn't account for thick character. In fact, it says it's an illusion. So that's my assessment of module tropes. So the other way to think about module tropes is to think of them as what I call character makers. And here, a character maker is something that, I don't know, to put it as a metaphor, sort of aims its characterizing guns at something else and sort of characterizes it, right? So it's one thing making another thing charactered in some way. That's what a character maker is. So if module tropes are character makers, then you have a sphericity trope. It is itself spherical, and it makes something else spherical, where the something else is a numerically distinct thing. So as a result, you'll have two spheres. You have the original sphere, which is the trope, and the sphere, the object that is made into a sphere, made spherical by the trope. So that, as we see, will be a problem with the view. Okay. So the whole object on this view can be thickly charactered in virtue of being multiply characterized by a bunch of singly charactered objects, the tropes. So the advantage is it does account for thick character, but the disadvantage is that it has what I call character overdetermination. There are two spheres where the module trope is at, the sphere and the object that it spherizes. And this is problematic because you don't want to have character overdetermination across the board. Where there's a mass trope, there'd be the trope is massive and its object is massive. There's too much mass there. This is similar to the two thinkers problem and other problems concerning material constitution, where we have too much of something as a result of a metaphysical theory than we're supposed to. It also makes character making rather mysterious because it's not just that there's a thinly charactered spherical entity, the trope, it somehow produces a sphere that is not itself. So you have a sphere making another sphere. Rather mysterious. Okay, so there are the pros and cons of the two ways of thinking about module tropes. We'll come back to this in a moment. Modifier tropes, let's see if they can do any better. And here there's only one view, so it'll take us half as long. So how do modifier tropes work? Well, they are character makers. They're not themselves charactered. So all they can do, if they're going to ground character, is characterize something else. They're bearers. So a sphericity trope is not itself spherical, but it makes its bearer spherical. So when you have an object, it can be thickly charactered in virtue of having a bunch of these modifier tropes. So the advantage, as we'll see, is that on this view, you can account for thick character and you can avoid character overdetermination, because where there is a sphericity trope, there's only one sphere, namely the thing that it makes spherical. The trope is not itself spherical. And it sort of avoids character overdetermination, and it accounts for thick character. The downside is, like the view where you take module tropes to be character makers, on this view, character making is rather mysterious. It just somehow pulls it off. In addition, and this is a unique weakness of modifier tropes, the concept of a modifier trope is merely a functional concept. So if I say sphericity trope, it's a modifier trope, tell me something about the trope itself. Well, what can you tell me? Well, it's a non-shareable character grounder that spherizes something else. All we know about it is what it can do. It can do this thing, spherizing, but we don't know much about the nature of the trope itself, its intrinsic character. So the ontology for modifier tropes is undetermined, somewhat undetermined, and that's a weakness. So here we have the three different options for character grounding for tropes with their pros and cons. Here is my assessment. Your mileage can vary. I think that module tropes, if you take them to be mere proper parts, so this is Themotrope Theory, I think the fact that they cannot account for thick character is a fatal flaw. I think thick character is what we like to call a Morian fact. It's among the things that are so obvious that we should reject any theory that implies that they're not real. So that, for me, that's not an option. The remaining two views both share this mysterious thing called character making. They both share it, so in my view, they're sort of on par with respect to that. It's undesirable, but at least they're on par. However, I think what's fatal, or almost fatal, about the module trope view where they're character makers is that it leads to character overdetermination. That is is widely taken to be a fatal flaw of view if you end up with character overdetermination, and I agree in this case as well. We're still stuck with this weakness of modifier tropes, that they're merely functional concepts. And I guess we'll have just a minute for me to tell you a way to resolve this, or my way to resolve this, and it's to adopt a view that I've defended. I call it Theistic Conferralism. But let me just quickly say what it is, and then we can have some time for questions. So notice, because it's a functional concept, the concept of a modifier trope, we're not told what it is that plays the role. So what I mean is that the very concept of a modifier trope is the concept of a role that needs to be played. There's something that plays the role of a modifier trope. And because it's something that does a certain kind of thing. So my proposal is, let's let divine actions, some of them, play this role of a modifier trope. The first thing to say is, because it's a functional concept, it doesn't rule out the possibility of taking divine actions to play this role. In addition, divine actions are non-shareable. That is, they can be, at least. God can act in a specific enough way that his action is only for one object and not for more than one object. And in that sense, it's a non-shareable action. And then, generally speaking, divine actions are not in any sense self-exemplifying. So divine acts are all of these things. They're non-shareable, they're not self-exemplifying, and they can play the role of modifier tropes. If we do that, we have a kind of nominalism about properties, because we're reducing the concept of a property to that of a divine action. So my proposal really is, why not take modifier tropes to be divine actions? If we do so, we mitigate some of the problems for trope theory, as well as other things as well. So on this view, creaturely character, not divine character, but creaturely character would be directly grounded by divine actions, where each of those divine actions is a modifier trope, in that it confers character on a creature. Where this conferring character, I should stress, is not an efficient cause, it's a formal cause. In the same way that properties, non-self-exemplifying properties, are formal causes of the character of things. Okay, I think I know I hustled through that last bit, but I think I should stop there, and let you raise your worries and questions and so on. Okay. I'm going to unshare this. Should I unshare the screen? I should do this, or maybe I need to go back to it.
So at this point, anybody who has questions, feel free to ask them. I will try to monitor and keep an eye on it if our speaker can't. Also, if you have a question, you want to put it in chat, I'll draw that to his attention as well. Looks like you might be up for now, Andre. Why don't you just give it a shot and we'll let the students think a little bit. Go for it.
All right. So I really enjoyed your talk, Robert.
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions, actually. There's a lot going on here. I've enjoyed your work on trope theory. In fact, I've had a recent exchange with somebody in print that he's helped himself to your work to deal with my work on causation and my criticism of substance causation. But I'm wondering if this is just a general question about a person's commitments about objects and whether or not that's going to make a difference with respect to what their commitments might be about the nature of tropes, whether they're going to be module tropes or modifier tropes. So in particular, I'm wondering if, for instance, if somebody has a one category ontology and they endorse bundle theory, say, is that going to imply a commitment to module tropes? And then similarly, right, if I have a two category ontology, I take substance to be an irreducible ontological category, is that going to commit me, do you think that's going to commit me to modifier tropes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't say it commits you. That sounds like a pretty strong idea. I think that module tropes are much better suited for bundle theory. Or no, let me put it different. I think if you're going to be a bundle theorist, I think you really need module tropes. Actually, let me put this in the order of my convictions. I think bundle theory is almost just incompatible with modifier tropes. Okay. I think if you're going to be a bundle theorist, you probably got to try and make do with module tropes. If you think substance is fundamental, like if you have substrata, for example, I think it's natural to go in for modifier tropes. I think it'd be bizarre to try and pair substrata with module tropes. Yeah. So that, yes, I think there are natural affinities there. Maybe commitments, if you, in the strong sense, too.
Okay. Well, so I have a follow-up to that then. So how I'm thinking here in particular of somebody like Dave Robb and his work. And so take this cat in the hat problem that you're mentioning. Mm. If I understand David's work correctly, I think he's going to insist that he's going to argue in defense of restricted composition, right? So, and he's going to say that there's going to be this binding, if you will, between the tropes owing to there also being causal powers, right? And so I'm wondering if that kind of an approach, where now what you say is composition is restricted. It's not just this sort of loose amalgam of things that we can just say is we've got this aggregate and therefore we've got an object. We can baptize that as a, whatever we want to call the cat in the hat, right thing. It seems that a view like his might avoid that worry that you're raising about how we're supposed to now handle, right, the object as a receptacle, if you will, right, in which we've now placed this cat. So I'm wondering if you think a response like, if a theory like David Robb's would maybe help out the person who is committed to, or at least who thinks that module tropes are going to be the better way to go. I
see. Yeah, good question. Let me see if I understand what you're asking. Or here's one question I hear you asking. I've raised this cat in the hat problem, and the problem is that if you put a bunch of thinly charactered things together into a collection, how do you get the collection itself to be charactered in virtue of its parts? Is that like, so this question is, how do we get a thickly charactered fusion from thinly charactered proper parts? Is that the question?
That's basically it. And
okay.
And again, with David's account, it's he's understanding the tropes as being powerful qualities, right? That's sort of view, a la John Heil. So
the first thing I'll say is I don't think any kind of restriction per se is going to help, especially if it's primitive. If you say there, not just any plurality of module tropes forms an object, right? I think Laurie Paul wants to kind of make this move where it's just a primitive fact that certain pluralities, but not all, form the bundles or whatever. So one way to think of this is, so you suppose you have a plurality of thinly charactered objects, the module tropes. What do you have to do to them to get something that's thickly charactered? And merely saying that they compose a fusion won't do it, because there's a straightforward compositional fallacy that causes trouble there. So what do you have to add? If you make them close together, why does that yield thick character? So I'm not sure how primitive restriction on Mariological sums helps. I don't know about the way you think about tropes as being powers, how that is going to help them collaboratively yield a thickly charactered fusion.
Well, Ana Marmodoro has a proposal like this, where she says, okay, look, some powers are going to be structural powers, and in fact, for her, it's just everything's just powers, right? Substances end up bottoming out in powers on her account, and so what she says, look, there's these structural powers, and they're directed at sort of, I mean, it's because she's telling a hylomorphic story, right? So, but still, right? You get this, you've got the matter, which is the stuff, right? These. I mean, now we could characterize them as particulars in this case, of tropes, let's say, and right, they, owing to, again, their directionality or whatever, right, they end up, fusing into this thing that we can now describe as being an object that has, clear boundaries, and right, the reason it has those clear boundaries is owing to the way that these properties are, right? So that's the kind of proposal I'm thinking of here, that David Robb is describing differently than, say, Ana Marmodoro is.
Right.
But they're both doing something very similar when it comes to that, which is restricting composition owing to, where the restriction in this case is owing to the character of the tropes themselves, right? The properties themselves.
Okay.
And again, what they're directed at doing, right? So, and with what?
So I have a hard time thinking of powers as being module tropes. That may be part of it. So on their view, if you think of these powers as being modifier tropes, I think it works, because modifier tropes can, collectively jointly characterize something, and then you get a thickly charactered result. I mean, more needs to be said about that, but at least that's viable. But I don't know how to make sense of a power or a disposition as a module trope. So take fragility. Is fragility itself fragile? No, it makes its bearer fragile. It may vary from case to case, how our intuitions go. But when I think of powers, it seems like they need to be thought of as modifier tropes.
Well, I'm sympathetic to that, for what it's worth. I'm trying to just play devil's advocate here in terms of the way that Rob and others have tried to make this kind of thing work. And so,
so do you think that if you ask David Robb, hey, do you have module tropes or modifier tropes, would he pick one, or would he say, no, it's unfair to ask me?
That's something? A good question. I don't know. I mean, he just helps himself to trope theory, and then he tells this, the story about them as being powers, and then it does the work for him. But when I think about his account, they look an awful lot like module tropes to me. So
I agree.
Yeah.
In his monist paper, he says basically that, I forget what labels he uses, but you unify a substance by saying that its basic tropes are identical with each other. And so, if you take mass and charge and sphericity and they're all tropes, and you identify them with each other, then what's the result?
Yeah.
A massive spherical charged entity. So it's a multiply charactered object. Not even a module trope is the way I'm thinking of it. So I think I think his basic tropes are supposed to be like module tropes, but then he thickens up their character by this identification. And then the higher order tropes look like modifier tropes, because they're supposed to somehow aim their guns down below at this at the thing he's identified down below. And I think he has a hybrid view. I actually say this in a footnote in an article somewhere. But yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
So I have a question for you, unless there are any other student questions to throw in right now. Um, so my question is less metaphysically informed than esteemed Professor Bucharest of necessity, because I'm not as informed as he is. But so my question is about what happens at the very end of your talk, and this idea of using divine actions to solve the problem. And one thing that occurred to me, I mean, maybe there's a very simple answer to this. This is like, you know, one person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens, right? So you figure, all right, so God's existence can help support modifier tropes as character makers, and it sort of like takes away some of the downside to this. But I can see somebody saying, well, look, but your problem though is that there's no God, right? And if you need God's existence to solve this problem, this is like an obvious, you know, hazard to modifier trope theory, right? And so like this is a much worse problem to have than the fatal flaws with the alternatives. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a fair point. When I proposed theistic conferralism, this view, yeah, you're right. I don't mean it as if you like modifier tropes, then independently of your commitments or not regarding theism, you should adopt theism to solve your problems for your trope theory. Because yeah, that's to say, you know, here's how you solve your problem for tropes. You accept this massive further commitment in the existence of God. That's not really solving a problem unless you have independent reasons for being a theist. So yes, I take your point. I do mean it as for theists. Yes. So, but the way I've tried to defend it before is to say, if you're a theist, you got to be a modifier trope theorist. You know, that's the way to put it. It's not the other way around. But yes, that's a good point. Yeah, because that would look, yeah, jumping out of the pan into the fryer.
Thanks. That clears up a lot for me. I see Kim Peasy has a question here, so go for it, Joe.
Yeah, so I kind of piggybacking on Henry. I really enjoyed the talk, but as a theist, then how are we going to make sense of the properties of God, right? So at the bottom of that slide there, you kind of had this view to explain creaturely properties, but like, do we run into like an infinite regress problem, where we're going to need a divine actor behind God to give God his properties, or is there something else you're going to slip, like you can try to do here to account for God's properties? Or yeah, that was my question.
Yeah, great question. I do restrict it to creaturely properties because obviously it would be, it actually would be like Hugh McCann's view if I said that God characterizes himself. And I think that's, I don't know how to make any sense of that idea. At worst, at best, I can't make sense of it. Worst, it just seems crazy. So yes, I definitely want this restriction to creaturely properties. I don't think it's ad hoc or even, that costly, because I think already that we have to treat divine properties very differently than creaturely properties anyhow. I mean, if you believe in divine simplicity, there are no properties, strictly speaking. There's just the divine being. There are predicates and so on. So there are lots of complicated issues about God's properties, but I would not want to say that if I'm a trope theorist of any sort, or believe in universals, I would not want to also say that God's properties are universals or God's properties are tropes. So I think the distinction is well motivated, or if I could put it this way, the restriction is well motivated. Does that make sense, at least kind of where I'm coming from? Okay. Yeah.
follow up really quickly. Can I ask it or not? I don't know, Henry.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
cool.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure. All right. So actually, let's just follow up to that. So it looks like what you're saying then is, if you accept this theory of tropes as being divine acts, a commitment of the theory then is going to be, you have to accept, is going to be divine simplicity then, right? That's going to be an upshot of the view, if you want to avoid the problems that you're talking about.
I don't think it's a straightforward upshot. I think, let's see. We could ask it this way. Strictly speaking, are there any properties that are real, like let's just say natural properties, that both God has and a creature has? That there's some, is there any property that both God and a creature share? Like existence, I'm assuming is not a property. I'm tempted to say no to that. And if I say no to that, then there's no one over many problem with respect to the divine properties, because there's no many, there's just one. God is the only one that has the divine properties. So all that, the only kind of issue there is with God's properties, if you're not a simplicity theorist, is that there's a many over one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think that yeah, I don't, they're just, they seem like sui generis kinds of properties. The divine, if you think that there are divine properties, they seem sui generis. They're not going to be, not only are they not shared by creatures, but they're going to be very different. That's a way of saying I think they pose very different metaphysical problems than creaturely properties do. Among other things, divine creaturely properties are contingent. If you're, at least if you're a trope theorist. I don't know if Andre, if that sounds evasive or what, but it is something I am working on this theory, and it's that these are among the things I'm trying to sort out, whether the restriction is unbecoming or well motivated. What do you think?
Yeah, I did see the details of the account. It seems to me, from where I'm standing, that just seems to be a straightforward implication of the view. But I mean, you're not in bad company. At least historically. So,
right. I'm not. It wouldn't bother me if that's a commitment of the view.
Yeah.
I'd like it not to be, but if it is, oh well.
Yeah.
I have to hang out with all those, classic philosophers.
Yeah, all of the Thomists and stuff. Yeah, so yeah, bite the bullet and
right. Not
they'll
bad
be happy.
Company. Right.
All right, unless there's anything else, I think this might be what we have time for tonight. So please help me give a virtual thanks to Professor Garcia. I'll just gently applaud here in my quiet online way. Hopefully I will see many of you at the next talk, Think Like a Feminist. All right, thank you very much. Feel free to log on. All right.
Thanks so much, Robert.